Ponderosa Center Presents. I'm Nicole Musgrove, the Development Director for the Ponderosa Center. And tonight our program for Ponderosa Center Presents is Global Climate Change and its Effects on McCall. And our wonderful presenter will be Jan Eitel, professor at University of Idaho, McCall Outdoor Science School. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to him and take it away, Jan. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Nicole, for the kind introduction, and thanks to everybody for being here. I realize it's Earth Day today, and probably a lot of people are outside right now enjoying the Earth, and that's what they should do. And hopefully maybe watch this afterwards, because it sounds like this recording will be available to folks. So, well, thanks everybody for being here today to listen to this presentation. Before I get started with my presentation, though, I would like to tell you a little bit more background about myself. Nicole asked me to. As she mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Idaho, and I'm actually located here in McCall, where I teach mainly ecology. I'm also teaching data analysis as well. And I came to McCall in 2010. So more than 10 years ago, I came to McCall and feel very fortunate that I am working here in McCall and that I have the opportunity not to only teach the students here we have here at Moss inside, but also take the students outside to the great outdoors and teach them about ecology. So, and then I guess the last thing I say too, you probably detect a little accent here in my voice. So that's a German accent. And so if there's anything unclear, I guess afterwards you have the opportunity to ask me if anything is unclear. And so with that, today my focus of the talk will be global climate change and effects on McCall. So now, when we talk about climate change, I think the first thing I really think is very, very important to understand what is climate, because there seems to be quite a bit of confusion of what climate is. And climate is really, if you look at weather over a long period of time, when I say a long period of time, we're talking about 20 or 30 years, and you look over the average of weather during that time, then this is what we call to be climate. And that's a very important definition when we talk about climate and climate change. Or if you want to say it maybe a little more, not as scientific, but maybe a little bit more lighter, you could also say climate is what you expect and weather is what you get. And again, this is very, very important to understand what climate is, that we're talking about long periods of time, 20, 30 years, which for us humans is quite a bit of time, right? And the importance of that, again, this definition of climate being over a long period of time is shown in this little figure here, where you see the annual mean temperature here on the y-axis, and on the x-axis here, you see the time, right? And so now if you take a look at this figure, I think a lot of people would see right away is that we see actually a pretty strong increase here in the annual mean temperature here over time, right? So if you start here in 1990, and then we see a gradual increase in temperature to 2020, right? However, now if we just select, let's say, a few random points, we might see something completely different. So for example, if you take here 4 years, you might actually see a cooling trend throughout the 4 years, right? So again, this is why it's so important that if we talk about climate change, we're talking about usually about periods of 20 or 30 years and how the weather changes within this period. And this is when we talk about climate. And again, this is so important because again and again, it comes up in the press that we take certain weather events as kind of signs of climate or climate change. So for example, very recently, I don't know if you guys remember, but we had snow in Austin, Texas, for example, right? Well, some people might say, well, this is strong evidence that climate change is not really happening. In fact, like we see some cooling. Well, I would argue this is weather. Similar, last week, actually, I was fortunate to be doing some research up in the Arctic, Alaska. And when we were up there, we saw a bunch of caribou, but we also saw that actually the snowpack up there right now is there's almost no snow up there right now. And again, this could be also, again, seen by some folks as indication that, well, maybe climate is actually warming, right? Again, I would argue this is a weather event, and we should not confuse that with climate change. Now, if you look over the temperature of the Earth's surface over a long period of time, over more than 100 years, what the records show is that across the globe, we see a very strong warming trend that is unprecedented. So in many regions of the Earth, we see the Earth temperature increase by 1 degree Celsius up to 2.5 degrees Celsius. And you see that up here, this warming, this very strong warming is mainly focusing here more in the northern regions. And this is why also I personally do a lot of research up there, where we see very strong warming. But if you're like myself, you might ask the question, well, right now he's showing the globe, but what about McCall, our little town of McCall? Do we see any changes, or any evidence of climate change here in McCall? And I think that's a good question, and that's something I would like to explore with you a little bit here in the next in the next 10, 15 minutes. Now, to do this, we have actually some very nice longer-term climate data sets available here for the McCall area. One of the very important data sets of climate change here in the area is collected by the snow telemetry sites. So the snow tel sites, some of you might be familiar with those sites, maybe checking, this snowpack, how much snow we have, those type of things. And those snow tel sites have been around for 20, 30 years in many instances. So for example, there is a snow tel site at Bear Basin. Again, some of you might be familiar with the area. If you're a Nordic skier, this is on Lyle's Loop actually there, and it's a little bit hidden. Maybe you're a Nordic skier, but have never seen it. It's a little hidden. And this snow tel site has been around for more than 30 years. So it's a great place to get some climate information, to understand how is climate really changing here in the McCall area. So now if you take a look at the mean annual temperature here in the McCall area, that was recorded again by this Bear Basin site here in McCall, what we see is that the annual mean temperature has been increasing statistically significant between 1990 and 2020. So there's very strong evidence that there's a very strong climate warming trend here, based again only on this Bear Basin data set. And that is quite impressive if you look here at this, first of all, at this slope, but then also in 1990, we had approximately mean annual temperature was around 2.5 degrees Celsius or so. And now in 2020, we are up by almost 2.5 degrees Celsius. And that's a very strong warming trend. Now to take another look at this air temperature data set, what you see here, you see the air temperature during August. Also, and this is also again pulled from that snow tel site at Bear Basin. And what you see here, you see the frequency distribution. So how likely is it to have certain temperatures in mean temperatures in August? And again, when I talk about mean temperatures, that also includes nighttime temperatures. And when we take a look here at the frequency distributions, what they show, for example, is that if you take a look here at the blue curve, that is very likely to have a temperature that's around 15 degrees Celsius, right? So this is a high likelihood here. Versus if you go to the outsides or tails here of this distribution, you can see it's very unlikely really to have mean temperatures in August that are below 5 degrees Celsius or above 5 degrees Celsius, right? So now if you take a look at these two curves, you see the blue curve, and that's the likelihood distribution for the period between 1989 and 2003. And then you see the pink one here, and that's the frequency distribution between 2003 and 2018. What you can see is you see a shift. So you see a shift towards the right, which means, again, strong evidence here that we have a warming trend happening here in this area where these temperatures are getting warmer. Now you might ask the question though, that's great, these are air temperature data, but what about other meteorological variables such as snow, right? Snow here in this area is incredibly important for all sorts of different reasons. And so what about the snowpack? Do we see any sorts of trends in the snowpack? Well, what this figure shows here, that shows the snow water equivalence information that was collected by the snow tel site at Bear Basin. And what we see in this case here, so here snow water equivalent, so that's really the snow depth, so the amount of snow we have. and the maximum amount of snow we have for given years. And what we really see here, we don't see any sort of trend. So the snowpack within those last 30 years seem to stay fairly consistent based on, again, on this one data set. But what about other snow metrics? Another very interesting snow metrics is actually snow onset, which is kind of like the snow phenology. You know, when do we see the onset of snow? When do we see the first snow appearing? And when does the snow disappear, for example? Now, this figure here shows the snow onset. And again, between 1990 and 2020. And what we see here, we see a slight trend towards later onset of snow. So it seems like we're getting snow slightly later in the year, but only by a few days. However, also I should mention that this is not really statistically significant or in any way significant. So there seems to be not very strong evidence that we see a change in snow onset. Now, in terms of snow disappearance, again, on this, based on the Bear Basin SNOTEL site, what we see here is that snow disappearance there seems to be a slight trend towards, interestingly, towards later snow disappearance. Again, this relationship is not really statistically significant, so we cannot really say, well, there's very strong evidence that we actually have that snow disappears later, but there seems to be a slight trend there, but again, not statistically significant. So in terms of snow phenology, we don't really see any sorts of pattern here. Now, another very interesting data set, and some of you guys might be familiar with that, is the ice breakup data set we have for Payette Lake. And that's a very interesting data set because it goes back more than 100 years. So it started in 1909 when people started recording the ice breakup of Payette Lake. And it's still maintained until today. I believe it's by the McCall Chamber of Commerce that kind of maintain this. I personally got the data from the Star News. And based on this data set, I try to understand, do we see any sort of trends in terms of ice breakup? Does it start earlier or does it start later? Well, if you plot this out, and you can see here on the y-axis, this is the Julian day and ranges from 80 to 140. If you convert Julian day to actually something we can understand like months, so the Julian day 80 would be March 21st, and Julian day 140 is May 20th. What we first see is we see an incredible scatter of ice breakup dates, right? Sometimes it's very late, sometimes it's quite early. So there's really a big scatter, bringing home again this message of the importance that when we talk about climate, we have to talk about a longer period of time, more than 20 years, usually 30, 40 years or so. And so we see, first of all, an incredible scatter here. However, if you fit some sort of like trend line through this data, what we are seeing here is that we actually see a statistically significant decrease here in this slope here, meaning that ice is breaking up earlier and earlier in the year based on this very long-term data set, more than 100 years worth of data that indicates that we see ice breakup happening earlier and earlier in the year. And the ice breakup if you look at these changes in terms of ice breakup, so in around 1920, the average ice breakup was around 125 Julian days, so that's around May 5th. And nowadays, the average ice breakup is around April 20th. And again, this is just an average. And obviously, as you can see, there's quite a bit of scatter. But there's very strong evidence that this ice breakup is earlier and earlier in the year. So now in conclusion, in terms of like summarizing these very interesting climate data sets we have available here for the greater McCall area, we can, in summary, there is pretty strong evidence that climate is also warming here in the McCall area, which basically supports of what we are seeing worldwide. So the next time you see this map like that shows that the globe is warming, McCall is certainly part of this. So now we talk quite a bit about climate and how climate is changing, and that's basically the physical environment we live in, right? But so now you might ask a question, well, this is a physical environment, this is temperature, but how do living things respond to it? How do animals respond to this? How does vegetation respond to that? And that's a very, very good question. And that's something a lot of us are exploring. However, there's quite a bit less known about how does an animal, for example, an elk, respond to this warming? How does vegetation respond to this warming? That's a little bit more complicated to answer those questions. And that's actually a lot of my personal research focuses on exactly this, like how does vegetation, how do animals respond to warming? And so for the remainder of this, my little presentation here, I'm going to show you a little bit of how I personally, with my own research that happens here in McCall, how I try to address this. Now, for a lot of my work I'm working on, I'm actually making use of long-term satellite data sets. And most of you are probably familiar with these type of data sets. Most of you are familiar with Google Earth or Google Maps, and you've seen these images of the landscape. And what's kind of great about these satellite images that they have been collected for the last 20, 30, 40 years. So they're a great way for us to kind of go back in time to understand how vegetation, for example, changed in response to this warming we're observing on the landscape. So I make a use of the satellite data actually quite a bit. One of the things I'm particularly interested in right now is, can we take the satellite time series, which again, sometimes go back 20, 30, 40 years, can we use these satellite time series to really understand how trees are growing? Can we understand how trees are growing? And the reason for that is that if you get a better understanding of that, we get a better understanding of how trees might be responding to climate change. Do they grow slower? Do they grow faster? Do they grow, or do we see more mortality? And answering these questions is incredibly important because tree growth has a very strong effect on all sorts of different biogeochemical cycles, such as the water cycle or the carbon cycle. So answering these questions is incredibly important. And obviously, you want to do this across the landscape or the world. And that's why this remote sensing and using the satellite data could be potentially very useful. Now, to answer this question, if we can use remote sensing data, these time series of data that go back 20, 30, 40 years to understand how trees are growing, what I make use of is what's known as point dendrometers. And you can see a little figure of a point dendrometer here. These point dendrometers, what they can do is they can track tree growth in very, very, very small detail. So here, if you take a look here at this figure here, you see the tree growth here on the y-axis, and which is in centimeters. You see here millimeter increases, so really micrometer like changes here in terms of tree growth, tree radius, I should say. And you can see here we have, this is Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So this is for a period of 1 week. And you can see that those point dendrometers are allowing us to measure these increments of tree growth in very, very, very fine detail. And so what I'm doing then is I have these sensors on the ground, and I try to understand if we can link some of the signals we're getting with these satellite data, if it can link that to what we're observing here on the ground. And so what we found in a recent study that we just published last year in the Journal of Global Change Biology, what we found is that the needle greenness, which we can get with satellite data, that the needle greenness, which changes slightly throughout the year. And I encourage you to look at this right now, because right now the trees of the conifers are still quite yellow, and then they turn towards being a little bit more darker green. And this change in greenness, again, we can remotely track. And what we found is that actually this change in greenness tracks quite well of how fast a tree is growing and when it stops growing, for example. And that's quite interesting. And so you can kind of see this in this little animation I'm playing here now, and I'm stopping this for a second. So here, these circles here, these black circles, that's the radial tree growth, or the tree growth itself, so how much the tree is growing. And then here you see the triangles in kind of like yellowish greenish, and that's the greenness of the needles, which again can be detected by remote sensing by these images I showed earlier. And if you play this animation, you can see that the greenness of the needles tracks quite nicely the growth of the tree. And now what you see is the tree stops growing, which is quite interesting. And once that tree stops growing, what we see very interestingly too, that once that tree hits that threshold, what happens to the greenness of the needles, they become lighter again. So kind of like a more yellowish kind of like appearance. And so again, then this study then suggests that we can use remote sensing to potentially track the growth of trees throughout a growing season, and might be able to go back in time to better understand of how climate, this warming, might affect tree growth. So this means, again, that hopefully, based on these very recent findings, we can go back in time using these satellite time series that go back to the 1980s to better understand of how this change in climate, for example, here in the McCall area, how this increase in temperature, air temperature, might affect tree growth. If you're interested more in this type of work, I can certainly hook you up with this recent publication here. If you want to get a more in-depth information about this work. But another way to engage in some of this work I'm doing here also out of McCall is I put together a little application you can access by using this link down here. And this little application, what it shows here on the upper left-hand corner, it shows tree radial growth. And it tracks that life. I basically have a point dendrometer or dendrometer attached to a tree here in McCall at the Noakes Experimental Forest. And that dendrometer, again, tracks the tree growth. It's updated live, or every day it's updated, and it should be able to track the growth of the tree and how that growth responds to changes in air temperature, soil moisture, and soil temperature. So maybe something you might be interested in to kind of follow tree growth this year. One thing I should mention right now, if you go to that link, as of what is today, April 22nd. Right now, you still get the data from last year. I'm just right now in the process of changing this application over to a new tree, but I hope in the next 1 or 2 weeks, this will be live and you should be able to track tree growth using your phone, for example, by just using this link here. Another thing I'm interested in is how does animal behavior, how is that affected by the warming we're seeing? And again, for this, I'm making also, again, use of satellite data. So a lot of my work is really based on satellite data. And we're making use of tracking data by tracking animals, by putting collars on them and tracking how they move across the landscape. And based on that information, we're trying to understand of how animals are responding to warming. So in one of my recent studies, one of my PhD students, Jyoti Janavan, she examined how moose are responding to this increasing warming by selecting for different landscape features. Do they select for canopy cover when it gets warmer? Do they get closer to water bodies, or do they go higher in elevation? And what Jyoti found is that amongst the variables she examined, that actually canopy cover is a very important way of how moose avoid heat stress. So the warmer it gets, the more likely they are getting towards a very dense canopy. And that has some very important management implications, meaning that with this increase in warming we are seeing, that it is very important for moose to have these denser canopy covers available, and we should manage for dense canopy cover. And with increasing forest fires on the landscape and things like that, that's definitely something we have to look out for, to provide them with those thermal refugia, as we call them. Again, if you want to learn more about this recent work, there's also a paper that's out there that has been published in Movement Ecology, and I can refer you to that as well and send that to you if you're interested. Just reach out to me. So just in conclusion, to just summarize some of my work, obviously based on my work and others, a lot of people trying to really understand right now, we are very clear that the climate is warming at an unprecedented rate. What we know less about is really how do living things respond to it? How do animals respond to it? How does vegetation respond to it? And that's really something we're actively researching right now, but a lot more research is really needed to completely understand this, which is quite complex to understand. So with that, I really, again, thank you for attending today's presentation. I realize right now, looking outside my window, it's beautiful weather. So thanks for attending this presentation today. And Nicole, I think we have a little bit of time for some questions here. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jan. That was a really well done presentation, very informative. Does anyone have any questions at this time about the presentation or anything else on the topic? Anybody? He did such a good job that there's no questions. That's good.
Usually that's not a good job.
Nicole,
That's
Nicole, I have a question. Just logistically, will this I would like to check out those links. Will this presentation be recorded or made available?
Yes, the presentation is being recorded right now, and it will be on our YouTube channel, but we can also source the links from Jan, and we will be following up with everyone that participated via email. So we can definitely get those to you, Tom, no problem.
So one more question. I attended a class last semester by a BSU professor who looks at snowpack measurements. His focus is, well, he has a bunch of different focus, but he has maybe a hammer looking for a nail, but I think he uses a lot of ground radar measurements to measure snowpack. And I wonder if those kind of measurements play into Professor Eitel's work.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and you're probably referring to HP Marshall.
Yes.
And HP and I, we work on some projects together. And just to clarify, HP is really, he looks really at the landscape scale at those snowpack conditions. And in a lot more detail than I do. I'm really more like an ecologist to really try to understand of how living things such as tree or animals are responding to some of those changes. So HP is really more like, he has a lot more in-depth knowledge about some of those snowpack changes. And the first part of my presentation is also, it's more like for me, like an exploration I wanted to do here, being in McCall and trying to understand if we really see these changes here. Rather than a real peer-reviewed type of work, and so, but HP and I, we are working together, and in fact, we just got a project funded together to look at some of those things, these interactions between snowpack and how living things are responding to it.
All right, thank you. That was a fascinating presentation, and it was nice that you could tie it right directly to McCall. Very, very nice. Thank you.
Thanks for attending.
So it looks like Colby may be typing a question, but Colby, you're welcome to just ask live.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'll speak up. I wasn't sure if we'd be unmuted or not. So I was going to record it, and then I got watching, and so don't worry. It's a good thing it was muted on our side because it was mortal chaos around our dinner table. But so one question that I was thinking about is just in terms of, every August around McCall, everybody's on edge. Not every year, but many years when you got fires going. Is there much, have you guys done much research or much plotting of data just in terms of the fires, their size, their growth, those things which kind of, correlate, I would assume, to temperature and water, and some of these other things that you addressed today. Have you guys done anything regarding that?
Yeah, so there is actually quite a bit of work going on by some fire ecologists in our college that really look into a lot more detail into some of those things. I personally I'm not really involved in a lot of this type of research, but there's certainly people that do some of this work quite a bit, and that's really what they're ultimately interested in. But there is some evidence, or pretty strong evidence, that that the severity of fire is really and the sizes we're seeing is increasing. And there's some, if you're interested, I could refer you to a few publications that really show that quite nicely, that we are seeing these changes in towards more higher fire intensity and also size. So there's definitely a pretty strong trend towards those things. But I'm certainly not an expert in this area, but we do have several faculty that's what they're focusing on as part of their research.
Sounds like a presentation.
Mm-hmm.
I'll grab your email address. I'd love to hear about that. And I lived in Germany for about 5 years total in my life. So gut gemacht.
Gut, alles klar. Wir können mal auf Deutsch reden.
Ja.
All right.
Any other questions?
Yes, this is Mike Wisenbach, and I have a question regarding Professor Eitel. You showed some information. You said it was still based on last year, but it was tree growth and the relationship between tree growth and the greenness that could be detected by remote sensing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious what trees you were looking at. I think I heard you say that there was one tree, and I'm assuming there had to be more than one, but curious about which species you're looking at. And then I'll just also add, my question is there evidence to show a shift in species composition in our forests in this in this area?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
that could be tied. That obviously that could be tied to changes in climate.
Yeah, a very good question. So the first question about the what tree and what tree species. So as part of this work, we focus. So as I mentioned before, a lot of my work actually over the last few years has been focusing on vegetation in the Arctic regions, because we see that the warming there is just accelerated. And that's mainly due to, decreasing snowpack, less ice, meaning there's less ice to reflect the solar radiation back into the atmosphere, meaning it heats up just a lot faster. So we have like a positive feedback happening there. And so we see these warming trends up there. So a lot of my research is really focusing on these regions. And so we work with black spruce and white spruce up there. And that's really what this work is based on. Now we extended some of this work, and this is really what I'm right now working on. So we kind of like based on these experiments we did up there in Alaska and Canada, we established some research sites here, for example, in Idaho, but then we also have a good collaborator at Columbia University in New York. And we established some follow sites there, and we see very similar trends with all sorts of different species, like it's Grand fir, Douglas fir, things like that. So we see these trends, this strong linkage between this slight change in greenness. And when I say greenness, it's really like those changes are very, very small. And again, like I encourage you, when you're outside and just look at one tree, maybe every day from now on, and you can see that it's slightly changing color. It's very small, but it's slightly changing color. And so basically what our data more and more suggests that these greenness changes throughout a wide range of different species are really quite well linked to the growth of the tree. Obviously, this is not perfect, but it's there seems to be a pretty strong linkage there. In terms of species composition and how species have been changing, I personally don't really know if we see any changes, or if like I personally have not looked into that or have done any research on that, of how species composition has been changing and monitoring that. So I can't really answer that question. Since I really haven't looked into that, but I'm sure some folks working on those type of questions, but I personally don't really know.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Does anyone else have any more questions? Okay. I think that answers that. Professor Jan Eitel with the University of Idaho McCall Outdoor Science School. Thank you so much for your presentation. We really appreciate your time and expertise tonight, and very well done storytelling through your slides here. So thank you so much. We appreciate all of you attending. Ponderosa Center Presents is our virtual presentations through Ponderosa Center. We will have this recording out on YouTube for you very soon. You can look for it there and share it with all of your friends. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for everyone at the Ponderosa Center. And thanks again, Professor Eitel. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.